Right. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this webinar. My name is Furubelo Tambani, and I'm the Science Communications person for the NSCF. And welcome. Good morning. I hope everyone is well and is looking forward to this webinar. Today, we'll be covering the topic of policy and procedures for accessioning and de-accessioning specimens into and out of the collections. So I hope you're looking forward to it. Today we only have one person who will be running the show, and that's Michelle. Michelle Hamer, for those who don't know her, but I doubt there's anyone who doesn't. So yeah, we can just go to the next slide and I'll go through the webinar guidelines. So please keep your contributions helpful and considerate of the host and other participants. So that's everyone in this room. Let's just be kind and respectful of each other. You can use the chat box. You can do this right away. Use the chat box to say hello and let us know which institution you're joining us from. So can one person just write on the chat? Just to make sure that we have it working. While we get that going, you can also use the Q&A box during the webinar. If you have any questions that you would like to be answered, put them in the Q&A box and then we will make sure that we get them answered. If we don't get to them, please be patient with us and we will try to get them answered on the webinar link. And that will be on the YouTube channel where we will be posting this. So we will post the recording of the webinar on YouTube, on our YouTube channel. If you just go to YouTube, you'll find it. You'll search the name NSCF or Natural Science Collections Facility and you'll find it. We're also live streaming to Facebook. So either on YouTube once the recording is there, or Facebook immediately because we are live there, and the recording will also be kept there. And you can visit our website on the collections management page. We have all the information there, including recordings of the previous webinars and discussion forums, as well as presentations that were shared and information about the course. So please feel free to go there. Right, now that we have that done, we can now move on to Michelle to get us started on the webinar. Thanks, Michelle.
Okay, thanks, Fulu, and good morning, everybody. Thanks for joining us for this topic. So this topic of accessions and de-accessions is right at the beginning of the manual. I think it's chapter 1 and 2, but we're doing it towards the end of this series of webinars. So if you need more information, you can go to the manual, but it's right at the beginning. So what we're going to be covering is accession, so getting new specimens into the collection, what's the procedure and what are the kind of policy guidelines for that. And then de-accession, so when you want to remove specimens from the collection permanently. We'll be looking at some of the policy guidelines. So what are some of the kind of rules, the high-level rules? And then what are some of the standards and what are the procedures or workflows for accessioning and de-accessioning? So I think that these are often topics that are not considered to be a big deal. You get things in and you put them into the collection. What's the big deal about that? And if something can no longer be used, you get rid of it in some way. What's the big deal about that? It's simple. But I think things have changed and there's a lot more that's expected for managing and running a scientific research collection. So I think that almost every collection will have backlogs in unaccessioned specimens. So things that have been brought in, somebody dumps a box or several boxes of specimens at your institution and you don't have time to get to it. Students bring a whole lot of things from their project and dump them there. and then you're left to deal with them. So I think that this is a very common thing. So these backlogs in unaccessioned specimens and collections that have been donated. So this is a picture from SCIAB, and I think this is what they were faced with when they took over an orphan collection, and just shows the scale of what you have to deal with as an institution with a big bulk of material to be accessioned. I think it's quite a nightmare. People come back from leave or from a field trip and they get back to find this kind of thing waiting for them. And this is just another picture showing that orphaned collection that had to be dealt with by SCIAB. And so that's why it's really important to have very clear policy and very clear workflows and very organized systems for accessioning, because trying to deal with this kind of thing is a big challenge. So where do specimens come from? New acquisitions. Where do you get them from for your collection? So your staff go on collecting trips, scientists, the technicians, whoever goes off into the field, does a whole lot of collecting and brings back a whole lot of material. Researchers and postgraduate students from universities or from other institutions, they finish a project or they want a whole lot of specimens identified by your institution and they bring that in. They might leave it there permanently. Members of the public, so I'm sure all of you have had people who arrive there, they've had something fall in their swimming pool and drown, or they've had something bite them and they've caught it and they've brought it to you, or they've brought in a plant that they don't know what it is and they want to give it to you and put it there, and they want to know what it is. And then donation of private collections, so these would be collections that had been at somebody's home that they built up over many years and they suddenly can't look after it anymore, or they die and their family brings it into the institution. And then orphaned collections from another institution. So an institution closes down, or an institution doesn't have the money or the staff to look after a collection anymore, and so they move it into another one. So these are different sources of material. And the role of collection institutions is to serve as a repository for research collections. So especially those that are funded by the state, by government. This is one of the main reasons for their existence, is to keep growing their collection and allow researchers to voucher permanently, to put specimens there permanently as a permanent voucher for a study or project. So that's the job of the institutions. It's very difficult to say we're not taking any more specimens, because that's kind of why you exist. And not only from your own staff, but from external researchers and postgraduate students. But it's not that simple. It's not that you just take everything. So how do you decide what you're going to take, or what are your rules about what are you going to take? You can't take everything that everybody brings to you. So remember that a policy is a very high-level document, and it doesn't easily get changed because it has to go through a long approval process. And so you want high-level rules that will be consistent. They'll stay there for a long time. So, and a very important thing is that any specimens or collections accepted into the institution must be within the focus of that institution. So you must only accept collections or specimens that fit in with what you do. Then the second point that should be a policy statement is that you can only accept specimens or collections where you have the resources to care for that collection or that specimen. So you must have the staff, the space, the consumables, the security to be able to look after it. If you can't, then you shouldn't accept collection. The third point is that accepted specimens should have been collected legally and ethically. Next point. Any specimens accepted into the collection must meet the required standards in terms of the quality. So you can't just accept any old things that get dumped there. There should be a standard for them. Next point. Then there should always be a donation form, a formal agreement for somebody to hand over something, a specimen or collection, to your institution. It must be a formal thing, because you never know when people might come back and want it back or tell you what you can and what you can't do with it. So there must be a formal agreement signed by the donor and the institutional representative. And I've put a point there. So what do we do about staff of the institution? Do they also need to sign something when they bring specimens into your institution? Your staff have collected. Do they need to sign something? And then the sixth point is that there must be a permanent record kept of every specimen that comes into that institution, whether it's accessioned into the collection or not. Everything that comes in must be documented in a permanent record. And then the seventh point is that there should be no privately owned collections to be housed in the institution. And that might seem strange being here in the accessions policy, but it just means that you can't take in anything that belongs to a private individual, whether it's a staff member or somebody from outside the institution. Okay, so this would probably be your policy. You only need these high-level statements. You don't put any details in there, just these are kind of your rules, your guiding rules. And then all the details of your standards and your procedures and the scope of your collections are in other documents. So they can be annexures or they can be a separate document entirely. So the one big thing that is difficult to decide on is when people bring a specimen or collection to you and they want to give it to you. So you should have a guiding document about what is the focus of your institution's collections. What taxa does it cover? What kinds of material will you accept? And that's really important as a guide, because you might be put into very difficult situations. So it might seem simple, but what would you say if, and these are just made up stories, but it is the kind of thing that is difficult to deal with. So, for example, the National Herbarium belongs to SANBI. It's part of SANBI, and SANBI's board often makes decisions. And what if they said you have to take all the mammal skins from the zoo, from the animals that have died, because the zoo is also part of SANBI and we don't want to give them away, and so the National Herbarium must take them. So if you don't have any guiding document, what are you going to say? It's difficult. Next one. What about, and I don't know if the SIRE people are here, but what about if they offered a collection of pinned aquatic insects? So they don't have any. Would they take them? It's an important collection. They need some kind of guiding document. Next one. What about Bay World? So Bay World deals with marine mammals and herpetology. And now the minister, the NEC, wants to lodge his private collection of butterflies there. Are they going to turn him down? He's like the big boss. Next one. What about the Compton Herbarium? That's also SANBI's herbarium in Cape Town, and they've got herbarium specimens, but somebody is offering them a really valuable collection of artifacts that show how plants were used historically by traditional people in the Western Cape. So it's baskets and carvings and artwork with plants. Do they take it or don't they? Next one. A private collector leaves her collection of rare seashells from around the world to the East London Museum, and there's thousands of them. Do they take them? They've got a mollusk collection. Do they take them or not? Next one. And then a new curator of entomology at Durban Museum wants to start a collection of marine invertebrates. He goes diving every weekend and he collects amazing things, and he thinks that it would be good. They don't have a marine invertebrate collection at the museum, but why don't they start one? and he can build it from his diving things that he does every weekend. If you have no guiding documents, then how do you tell people no or yes, or this is why we're making this decision? Next point. And here's another one. So this is a difficult one. A PhD student who's done a large project on monitoring insect diversity wants to deposit 5,000 mixed samples from Malays traps at the KZN Museum. So these are little bottles with all different kinds of insects in them, and there's 5,000 of them. They're not pinned, they're not sorted. What's the museum going to say? They don't have that kind of collection. Next point. And then this one is also a difficult decision. A researcher has done a project on marula trees, and they've been collecting samples of one species, and they worked on one farm, and they've got 480 herbarium mounts, all from the same locality. Would you take them? Would any of the herbaria take all 480? Where, you know, you need your policy, you need your guidelines to tell you, even if you're a herbarium, what are the guidelines for what you take and what you don't? Next point. Yeah, so how do you say no to an instruction from high up or to anybody else if you don't have a policy and you don't have documents that you can refer to? People will be left in a very difficult position making these decisions. So you really need a document that details the scope of specimens that will be accepted. And you need to say which taxa. So have you got mammal collections? Do you only deal with higher plants? Do you deal with all plants? So what taxa do you focus on in your institution? But then also, what type of specimens will you take? So do you only take skins and bones and skulls, or do you take soft tissue, so the inside, the organs in a preservative? Do you take a whole specimen, so a fetus of an elephant in ethanol or formalin? Would you take that? Do you take frozen whole specimens? Do you take DNA extracts? Do you take tissue samples for DNA extraction? So you can see it's not just sort of simple. And then what about mixed and unsorted samples? So these are mostly from ecological studies, plankton samples, freshwater samples, soil samples, insects. Do you take those? Then the issue about duplicates, and this is where there's a very large number of individual specimens. They're all the same species, they collected from the same place, and they were collected at the same time. So do you have a maximum number that you would take? And what about if they over a different time period, if they're collected over a year? Or what about if it's the same species, but they're from a large number of different localities? So you need to think through all of these things. And then what documents will you take? So you need to also think about, do you take scans of things? Do you take hard copy documents? Do you take spreadsheets? Do you take databases in different kinds of software? What would you take? That should also all be documented. So that's the first point, the scope of what you will accept into your institution. The second policy point there was about having enough resources. So can you actually look after this material if you accept it? And this, you actually need like some kind of a checklist or some way of documenting how you made that decision. It's not good enough to just stand there and write on your hand and then go and wash it off. It needs to be written down. So a lot of institutions do have something called an intention to donate form. So before somebody donates, you ask them to fill in a form. And that gives you an idea of what's there. And you might even need to go and look at a collection. If it's a big collection, you might need to go and look at it before you make a decision about whether you'll take. You need to know how many specimens there are. You need to understand what is their current state. Are they unmounted plants? Are they mixed samples? Do they need relabeling, rebottling, pinning? So all of that information, is there a spreadsheet or a data set with them, or do you need to start capturing data from scratch? Do they need new containers, glass bottles, vials, boxes, insect drawers? How many? Do you need any other consumables? Do you need Alcamon tablets? And then how much space will this take up in cabinets or on your shelves? Do you need new cabinets or new shelves to accommodate it? And then is there enough space in the collection storeroom? And if the answer is no, and there's no option for getting more space, you probably can't take a collection. So, and then if you need to buy a whole lot of new things, do you have budget? And if you've got budget, how long is it going to take you to procure all of those things? And then you've got to think about your staffing capacity. How long do you think it's going to take to accession those specimens? To prepare them, to do the data capture, label them, put them into the collection. Are there staff who can do this? And can they allocate their time to do it soon? You don't want this sitting for 2, 3, 4 years. And then if they don't have time, if the staff don't have time, maybe there's interns, maybe staff from another department can help. And then think about what's the current level of backlogs in accessions. So if you've got backlogs for 10 years, do you really want to take more material into your institution before you've dealt with existing backlog? So this is all the things that you need to think about. Can we take this collection? And then this is a very difficult point, but it is an important policy point, and then you need to think about it. So the policy point would be that any specimens accepted must have been collected legally and ethically. So legally usually refers to the legislation, the law, and that's usually permits. So the legislation says that you can only accept specimens that have proof that the specimens were legally obtained. And that would be written landowner permission or a collecting permit. You may even have, whoever collected it might have been in the Eastern Cape, and you had a permit from Eastern Cape for it to be there, but now you need to move it to Gauteng. And Eastern Cape province has to authorize that export, that movement out of the province. And in some provinces, you need a permit to donate as well. So all of these things need to be in place, but often the documents aren't available. We know that, especially for old specimens. There's nothing, there's no permits. And what do you do about that? We have asked the Department of Environment about this before, and they suggested that if you're unsure, you check with them or with the provincial authority to get approval. And that's especially important if it's CITES or threatened or protected species material. So where it's heavily kind of regulated and anyone can come and check, where did this come from? Where was the permit that was collected under? So those are especially important. And then if you're accepting material from other countries, we have to make sure that it was authorized that that material leave that country. And that's usually in relation to the Nagoya Protocol. There has to have been an access and benefit sharing agreement signed between our country and their country for them to hand that material over to us. And then we know, and this is a nightmare for the animal, any animal specimens, the Section 20 permits for animal disease control. So anyone who's worked with this will know the challenges with it, but the law says that if you move any animal or any part of any animal, you need a Section 20 permit. So if you want to pick up roadkill, if a member of the public picks up a dead aardvark on the side of the road, they are legally not supposed to bring that into you, and you are not supposed to accept it. I think we will have to talk more to the, they fall under the Department of Agriculture, so we'll have to speak to them a bit more, but that's what the law says. And then ethics is different to permits. Ethics there's a little bit of link, but ethics is also different. So was there ethical clearance from somebody for the collecting and the killing? And that's especially for vertebrates. And then also for over collecting, so can you see that somebody's gone out and collected the last dodo or a whole lot of coelacanths? And that's not ethical because these things are extinct or near extinct. Is there any possibility that the specimens were stolen from somebody or smuggled out of another country without permission? Because that would be ethical as well as illegal. And then also, does the person donating have the right to donate those specimens or that collection? Are they actually the owner, or do they have written consent from the owner? So all of those things have to be thought about too. And then the fourth point in the policy guidelines is about meeting the required standards. And for this, it will really depend on the kind of collection that it is. So what condition would you accept that the specimens are in? How broken can a herbarium specimen be before it's not usable for research purposes? And then how much information do you need? And what kind of labels would you accept? So at the bottom there's one specimen, a little monkey beetle, and he's got all his information on the label. And then the next one is a beetle, and it's just got a field label, a code on it. Is that acceptable? Would you take that? And then also, if you were offered material that had dried out, it was very important, you could rehydrate it, would you take it? So those are things that all need to be thought about. And what are what's the minimum set of data, information about the specimen that you take? And then the fifth point in that list of policy guideline statements was about this donation forms. There is an example in the manual, a template there that you can use, and it asks for the donor details. It asks for their name, their ID number, their phone number, their address, and that's all fine. But you must remember that there's this Protection of Personal Information Act now. And so if you're getting that information from people, it's fine, but you have to make sure that that information is protected. It's looked after, it's secured, it's locked away. It's not left lying around, because somebody could get that information in and use it, illegally. So yes, ask for that information, but be careful, make sure that you're responsible for not letting it get out. And then the donor form should also give information about the specimens, how many and where are they from, and are they from a project? Have there been any publications from that material? Is there any documentation, so hard copy or electronic, for the specimens, things like data sheets, photos, a spreadsheet or database? And then the donor would also have to agree to donate the specimens with no conditions. So they must hand over all rights for whatever happens to those specimens to your institution. It becomes very difficult in future if you've allowed them to say they want certain conditions. And then that donation form must be signed by the receiving institution. There must be a list of all the specimens that must be signed off on to say, yes, they were all there and we did receive these. So that's your donation form, must have that. Even if it's one specimen, you must still have a donation form. Next slide. And then this, I know when the working group was developing the manual, there was lots of discussion and debate about this permanent record of every specimen that comes into the institution. And this is actually a requirement for CITES, species, but also it's recommended by all the sort of big international collections, organizations. So it must be handwritten in ink, in a register, in a book, so a book. So you can't, you would know if a page had been torn out, and you can't get rid of that entry. So it might not be every single individual specimen, but it could be a consignment. But then you need to know how many specimens are in that consignment. So if you look at that bottom picture in the corner there, the bottom corner, you would count how many little vials, and you would say this was this one donation, and it's so many vials. So one entry, but you say how many vials. And it's really best practice to record every single thing that comes into the institution, whether it's a loan that's coming back in, whether it's a loan that's coming in from another institution for the scientists in your institution, if it's specimens coming in for identification, specimens from staff collecting trip, donation of a specimen from a member of the public. So every single thing gets put into that register. And the date that it's received, and then also what happens to it. So if it was just coming in for an identification and it went back to its owner, when it goes back, it's recorded and signed off. If it's sent to a data capture unit to be put into the database, then that's written down. So you record everything that happens to these, everything that comes in, and it's signed off. Otherwise, it becomes chaotic. And then, yeah, just some further information about the no private collections. We mentioned them. So in the past, and this has happened more than once, curators or researchers in institutions have built up their own collection. So it's accessioned into the institution, it's cared for in the institution, but the researchers saw it as their own collection because they were the ones who went and collected that material. And when they've retired or resigned, they've taken that collection with them. And that's because it wasn't in their conditions of service or in their code of conduct, or they didn't sign anything, and the institution had no legal standing against them. That's why it is important for institutions to think about that. Private collections where the donor wants to retain ownership but wants the institution to care for the collection. I think that quite a lot that happens. So people say, I can't look after my collection anymore. I want to give it to you, but only when I die. And in the meantime, can I put it in your institution and you will look after it? You can't do that. And then often, especially for researchers, they'll say, I'm going to put my collection there with you, but I don't want anybody else to be able to access any of it without me authorizing it. And that also can't be. So just to say that then it may be acceptable to allow a time-bound embargo on donated specimens or new specimens collected by staff. So you might say, yes, for 3 years, we'll allow no one else to have access to this newly collected stuff. And after that, it will become accessible. So we'll talk about that more in the next webinar on access. Next slide. So those are just some further details, but for all of these different processes, you really need to have detailed documented procedures. So workflow diagrams like this one. So for donations, what is the step-by-step process that you'll follow? You'll first check the details of the potential donation. That might be the intention to donate form. You'll do your assessment of whether it meets the scope and scale of your institution, whether you've got the resources to take it. You'll submit a recommendation to the director or whoever signs off on that. Then you'll tell the donor, yes, we can accept your material. Then you'll complete the donation form. You'll take delivery of the specimens. You'll check the details of the specimens against the donation form. You'll check all the documents. If it's all signed off and in order, then you deliver it to your accessions place where it gets accessioned in the institution. So you can see point. And you can put in there also who's responsible for each of those steps. And then that's high level, that's broad. Then you need detailed steps for accessioning. What is the process? What's the step-by-step process for accessioning? So specimens documented in the accessions register, they get assigned a unique number, and you can put your time frames. You should have time frames in there. 2 days of receipt, we've got to do this. Then You get all the documentation that came with the specimens and you save it to the C drive on your whatever, on your institutional servers. Then you might have to do decontamination before you do anything else. Then you'd have to capture the data for those specimens and attach the documents that came with them. Then you send them for identification. Then they get labeled, then they might get mounted or remounted or bottled, rebottled, and then they can go into the collection. And then you update the database to say where they are in the collection. And then you go back to your accessions register and you sign off that they are now into the collection. So that's a procedure, a workflow drawing. And even that is too high level for some things. So you might need very detailed workflows. So how do you record everything that comes in? You know, what is that person going to check? What are they going to record? What are they going to do with the hard copy documents? What are they going to do with the scanned documents? So you can see here, this is very detailed. So the person doing the receiving and the registering will follow this procedure. So for workflows, you actually need workflows for all the different steps. So you have one high level one and then one for the different steps. So workflow for receiving specimens and recording the accessions register. A workflow for decontamination. So this is your freezing or however else you do decontamination. A workflow for data capture, and I think Ian did speak about that before. The same, whether it's an accession or whatever, data capture is data capture. Identification of specimens and recording the identity, what's the procedure for that? What's the workflow for that? Labeling, relabeling, what's the workflow for that? Remounting or rebottling or preparation, there should be a workflow for that. And then filing and placing specimens in the collection. So every step should be very clear exactly what needs to be done. Okay, so that's accession. So you can see all the detail in there. It's not as simple, take things, put them in the collection. But what about when you have to get things out of the collection permanently? So de-accessioning is a big issue globally. You can see I just took some of the things from the web. There's lots of information, and especially for humanities collection, but it's equally important for us. Next slide. So when would you de-accession? So you should have a policy for de-accessioning, and you can have policy guidelines, policy statements. These are guidelines for those. So you can remove specimens or collections permanently from the collection under the following circumstances. So if you're moving a collection to another institution because it's orphaned, doesn't fit within your scope of your institution, you don't have the appropriate resources to care for it, you don't have money, you don't have staff, you don't have space, or it may be that it's being repatriated to the country of origin. So suddenly Zambia asks for all their fish back from us and we have to send those back to them. And also sometimes you might have an exchange program. I know the herbaria at Sandy have this. So we give them duplicates and the other herbarium gives us their duplicates. And so we expand our collection like that. And then also for scientific purposes. So sometimes you have to deposit a paratype or an isotype in another institution. And so you might donate those specimens to another institution. And then also, what about specimens that have been eaten by bugs or they're really badly damaged and they'll never be able to be used for research purposes? And that might be where you've also lost the label, or you've mixed up labels and there's no way you're ever going to be sure about which label fits with which specimen. Then they have no scientific value, so they might have to go. And then what about specimens that were illegally obtained? So it is possible that government authorities can instruct you to destroy material that was illegally obtained. Or they might do it themselves. They might confiscate it from you and destroy it. And then specimens that pose a significant health risk to start. So you might have something that you just think is too risky and has to be destroyed. And then what about permanent loss of specimens? So often, not often, but it has happened. Specimens that were going out on loan or coming back from loan disappeared. Even from courier services, gone. Or there was a fire and the specimens are burned. So that's a de-accessioning process. And then what happens. So specimens from another institution that were on loan to you, there was some mix-up and they got accessioned in error into your collection. And now you have to de-accession them and send them back to where they came from. So there's lots of reasons for de-accessioning. So those, you would say, under these conditions, you can remove the specimens from the collection permanently. Other policy guidelines for de-accessioning, so it must follow an approved process and it must be authorized, it must be signed off. And then de-accessioning must also be legally compliant in terms of permits. So especially if you're transferring a collection from your institution to another one, you might need a permit or you might need permission or authorization to transfer it. So you have to check that. If you're going to be disposing, if you're going to be burning or throwing away something, you have to think about waste management. So there are regulations for air pollution and waste management. And there might also be health and safety implications. So you have to make sure that you're not breaking any laws. Then the fourth one, there should be a full record of decision-making process. And that is the kind of thing that will be checked by an auditor. They will want to see the paper trail for how the decision was made to give that collection away. And then 2 points that may be debated, but it's good practice not to sell the accession specimens, just because it can provide an incentive to start just getting rid of state assets, really, national assets. So they shouldn't be sold, and if you donate them, they should be donated to another institution and not to an individual. That's good practice. So for de-accessioning, there's also a whole process that must be followed. So somebody says, we're no longer able to care for this collection, it's out of the scope of our institution and our main focus, we're not growing that collection, it needs to go somewhere else. You have to go and see, are there any documents associated with the material? So donor agreements, collecting permits, publications, data sheets. Does it say anything about transferring that collection to a third party or destroying it, or its significance? So you have to see what is the story behind this. And then there should be a written motivation for de-accessioning or removing anything. It needs to have a whole lot of information. So accession numbers, description of the material, its condition, where it came from, how it got into the institution. And then if there are any requirements for de-accessioning it, any permits or donor agreements, why you want to de-accession it, and then what are you proposing to do with it, and then is there any resource requirements? So would there be any budget implications for moving it? And then once you've done the motivation, it needs to go for approval to whatever your chain of authorization is. It might be a committee, exco, a board, it might even be your government department under which you fall. Needs to be signed off by the appropriate accounting authority. So who is the ultimate person or body that makes decisions? They must sign off on anything that's got rid of. If it's going to another institution, there must be a formal agreement. So we've also had some experience with this, and we can help with templates. But it's a very important step, and I don't think it was always done in the past. So You say what each institution will do, the one donating and the one receiving, who's responsible for what, who will cover what costs, how long is this going to take, what the new institution can and can't do with the specimens, what will be transferred, so how many specimens, what their state is, and if you're going to be sending any of the storage infrastructure as well. So are any cabinets or drawers going with it, or is it just the specimens? And then who's going to get the permits, and at what point will the ownership be transferred? So at which point does the donating institution say this is no longer ours, and the new institution says now we're formally responsible? So all of that must be in the agreement. Okay, so you also have to get the permits or approvals. You have to make sure that the list of specimens is complete and correct. If you're moving it to another institution, it will have to be packaged. You might have to have a company to do the transfer. You have to record in the database and the accession register with what's happened to the specimens. And then for anything that's destroyed, so if you decide that this is no longer useful and we're going to be throwing it away, first photograph the specimens so that you have a record to prove that they were damaged. And then keep the labels, so keep the hard copy labels and photograph them or scan them and keep those on file. So if anybody ever questions, why did you destroy that? Or where's the evidence? You can show them. It's a very important step. Okay, so I'm not going to go through this in detail, but this is a kind of workflow for the whole de-accession process, and there'll be a different route if you're going to destroy or if you're going to donate. So it's important, it's easier to actually follow something that's in this kind of workflow format rather than a long, detailed text. Okay, so that's it. So accessioning and de-accessioning in summary. You should have a policy document for each of those processes, for accessioning and for de-accessioning. There should be a standards document for what you'll accept into the institution. You should have workflows for the process of accessioning and each step in that process as well. It should include timeframes, and it should include who's responsible for those different steps. You need forms, the donation form, and also a tracking form. So I didn't talk about this yet, but this is very important. When anything comes into the institution, it should get a tracking form with it that follows it through all the different processes that it goes through. And once it's accessioned into the collection, that gets filed by the accessions people. So there is an example in the manual for that tracking form, and there's an example of a donation form. Then the hard copy accession book, need that. And then for de-accessions, you also need standards. So how do you know when a specimen is useful for research? What are the rules for exchanging duplicates? So all your kind of standards. And then your workflow for de-accessioning, which is what I showed. You need a de-accessioning order form. That's in the manual. And then you need a filing system for all your hard copy documents. You need a filing system for all your electronic documents and images. And these should all be linked in the database to the specimen records. You need that specimen database, so specify, bronze. And then make sure that there's somebody who recommends each accession or de-accession, and at least 2 approvers for everything, because that's an audit process usually. So that's what you need to have in place to make sure that accessioning and de-accessioning all happens within the law and in a professional way and an accountable way. Okay, so these are issues, and I'm sure that they've gone through people's minds as I've been talking. So permits, it's such a difficult thing for us to deal with. How do you deal with donations that don't have the correct collecting permits? You can contact the authorities and they just don't respond. It's an important collection. If you don't take it, it's going to be lost. If you do take it, you might be in trouble because you don't have the permits. What do you do about the Section 20 permits where it is really, so for example, if a member of the public picks up an aardvark that's been killed on the road, it's such a valuable specimen, there's no Section 20 permits. What do you do? And that's a wicked problem. There isn't an easy answer. There's two aspects. Then this point about staff collecting material when there's already a massive backlog of specimens waiting to be accessioned and prepared and integrated into the collection. Is this ethical? Should you be going out and collecting more and more and more material and ignoring the backlog that's sitting there? So surely it's a priority to deal with backlogs before collecting more material. And that's a very difficult situation, and no one wants to talk about it because the researchers and people want to go and collect more material. That's the good part about working at a museum or a herbarium. Dealing with the backlogs is not fun, but think about the ethics. Then processes to be followed by internal researchers who collect. So how do you deal with that? Does it have to be accessioned immediately it comes in, or do they take it and put it in their lab or in their cabinets, and it doesn't go through an accession process until they say that it's ready to go? You've got to think about the professional, the accountability, the risks of having material coming in without going through a proper accessions process. And then the last point, I'm sure this is going through everybody's mind as they're seeing all these things you have to do. We've got ever expanding collections. We get more and more and more material in, and that's our job. We have to do that. But every year, we get less and less budget. And we have vacancies and they're not filled. So it doesn't make sense. This is a wicked problem. We're having more work to do and fewer resources to do it. How can we deal with this? And I don't know what the answer is. That's what a wicked problem is. There isn't an easy answer, but we need to think about how we're going to deal with this as a community. So those I just put there, I don't have the answers, but I know that they're wicked problems that all the collection institutions face. And that's it. So thank you for listening to this. It's a lot of paperwork, I know that. And I think it's the 31st of August. We're going to have the discussion forum. And it would be really good if we could have some inputs from people who work in the collections on lessons learned from accepting a donation or integrating a donation of a big orphan collection. So what did you learn from that? If you've had to deal with a big backlog, how did you do that? What did you learn from that process? And then if you have workflows for accessioning specimens, what are those workflows? So anything to do with accessioning, backlogs, orphan collections, moving them, whether you're sending them or you're receiving them. So anything like that, volunteers, please. Otherwise, I'm going to have to just pick on people again. Doesn't have to be long, can be 5 to 10 slides. And I just think it's been very valuable to hear from people who've actually got hands-on experience. So I'm really asking for people to put their hand up. You can just send me an email and let me know if you want to do that. And then if we've got time in the discussion forum, we'll also just go through some workflows just to get people started on developing these. There are various different formats and tools that you can use for actually putting the workflow together. And that's all from my side. Pulu's going to stop recording now.